On a Thursday morning in September of 1993, a woman named Evelyn Marsh stood in the middle of her mother's sewing room in Harlan County, Kentucky, and watched two men from a Louisville estate company write the number $175 on a yellow sticker and press it onto the side of a cedar cabinet that her mother had built by hand in 1961. The men were efficient. They moved through the house with clipboards and cameras and the particular briskness of people who have seen too many rooms full of other people's lives to feel the weight of any single one. They were not unkind. They were simply elsewhere in a way that Evelyn found, standing there watching them, almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Evelyn was 52 years old. She had driven down from Cincinnati the night before and had slept badly on the pull-out sofa in the living room. She had $340 in her checking account, which was not the kind of thing she had planned around when she had agreed, 3 weeks earlier, to let the estate company handle the liquidation. She had agreed because she did not know what else to do, and because the attorney handling her mother's estate had recommended the company, and because Evelyn had been in no condition at the time to argue with recommendations. Her mother, Ruth Marsh, had died in July. It was now the third week of September, and the estate sale was scheduled for Saturday. And Evelyn had come back to Harlan not because she thought she could stop anything, but because she could not stay away. She stood in the sewing room and looked at the yellow sticker on the cedar cabinet and said nothing. Let me tell you about Ruth Marsh first, because you cannot understand what was in that cabinet without understanding the woman who built it. Ruth Marsh had come to Harlan County in 1952 as the wife of a coal company bookkeeper named Harold, who was from the area and who had met Ruth at a church social in Hazard the previous summer and had decided, with the directness that characterized everything Harold did, that she was the woman he intended to marry. Ruth was 24 years old, had grown up in eastern Tennessee, and had been sewing since she was 9 years old when her grandmother had sat her down at a treadle machine and shown her, without ceremony or sentimentality, how fabric worked. What Ruth had learned at 9 years old and spent the following 43 years deepening was not sewing in the way most people use the word. It was not making curtains or hemming trousers or running up simple garments from a simplicity pattern. What Ruth Marsh understood, and what she had taught herself through decades of practice and a degree of methodical self-education that nobody in Harlan County fully recognized for what it was the structural logic of how cloth became clothing. The way a seam distributed stress, the way grain line determined whether a garment would hang true or pull and twist after 6 months of wearing, the way a collar could be cut to lie flat against a neck of any shape if you understood the geometry involved, and why it would never lie flat if you didn't, regardless of how carefully you pressed it. She had learned this the way people learn things when no one is teaching them, by taking apart things that worked and figuring out why they worked, by making things that didn't work and understanding precisely where they had gone wrong and why. She had a cabinet full of what she called her failures, garments she had made and unmade and remade until she understood the specific problem each one had been trying to show her. And she kept them not out of sentimentality, but because she believed that a mistake you understood was worth more than a success you couldn't explain. Harold had died in 1978 of emphysema, which took most of the men of his generation in Harlan County eventually, and Ruth had spent the following 15 years alone in the house on Clover Fork Road, sewing. She took in alterations and made garments for people in the community, and occasionally, through a quiet word of mouth that she never encouraged but never discouraged either, for people who came from Lexington or Knoxville, because someone had told them that Ruth Marsh could do things with fabric that the tailors in the city couldn't do, or couldn't do as well, or couldn't do without charging twice what she charged, and taking 3 times as long. Dollars. She charged almost nothing. Evelyn had grown up watching her mother take $12 for an alteration job that had taken 4 hours and required her to essentially reconstruct the lining of a suit jacket, dollars, and had spent her teenage years feeling something between frustration and embarrassment about it. She had not understood at 16 that her mother was not undervaluing her work, dollars. She was simply indifferent to its market price in the way that people are indifferent to things that are not the point, dollars. The point for Ruth was the work itself, whether she had gotten it right, whether she understood it better today than she had yesterday, whether the problem in front of her was one she had seen before or one that was going to teach her something new. Dollars. Let me tell you about the cedar cabinet, because that is where this story actually lives. Dollars. Harold had built the cabinet for Ruth in 1961 as a Christmas gift. He was a careful man with wood, the way he was a careful man with numbers, and he had made the cabinet with 6 deep drawers and a full-length door that opened to reveal 6 wooden pegs on the inside, and he had built it to Ruth's specifications, which meant the drawers were sized for the particular kind of order Ruth maintained in her work. Dollars. Evelyn had grown up with that cabinet in the corner of the sewing room and had never thought much about what was in it, in the same way you do not think much about the furniture of your childhood until it is about to be sold to a stranger. Dollars. What was in the cedar cabinet, Evelyn had discovered the week before the estate company came, was her mother's entire working life. Dollars. There were patterns, but not commercial patterns. Ruth had, over the course of 40 years, drafted every pattern she used herself, on brown craft paper with her own markings and notations, and she had modified and remodified them as her understanding had grown, annotating in pencil in the margins with observations that read less like sewing instructions and more like the field notes of someone conducting a long and private investigation. Dollars. There were notes on specific fabrics, how a particular wool from a mill in North Carolina behaved under steam versus how it behaved when pressed dry, and why the difference mattered and when you needed to account for it. Dollars. There were observations on body proportion that Ruth had developed from 40 years of fitting real bodies rather than dress forms. Dollars. And that went well beyond what Evelyn recognized from the pattern-making books she had looked at in the Cincinnati library. Dollars. And there were the notebooks, 3 of them in Ruth's small, slanted handwriting, covering what Evelyn could only describe as a complete theory of fit. Not a theory in the abstract sense. Dollars. A theory built entirely from practice, from the specific problems of specific garments on specific bodies, accumulated and organized and cross-referenced over 4 decades into something that Evelyn, Dollars, who had a degree in textile design from the University of Kentucky and had spent 23 years working for a mid-sized apparel manufacturer in Cincinnati, Dollars, recognized immediately as unlike anything she had seen in a professional context. Dollars. She had sat in her mother's sewing room for 2 hours on that first evening, reading. She had not cried, exactly, but she had sat very still for a long time. Dollars. The estate company had priced the cedar cabinet and everything in it at $175. The patterns, the notebooks, the 40 years of annotated knowledge, $175. Dollars. Let me tell you about Saturday morning in Harlan County, because that is where the story turns. Dollars. The estate sale drew about 45 people, which was a decent crowd for a house on Clover Fork Road. Most of them were there for the furniture, the kitchen things, the quilts that Ruth had made over the years and that were genuinely beautiful, and that Evelyn had already decided she could not afford to bid on and could not bear to watch go. Dollars. A few were there for the sewing equipment, the 2 machines Ruth had kept running for decades, the dress form that stood in the corner of the sewing room like a headless authority figure, practical things that someone would buy for practical reasons. Dollars. Evelyn had come with the $340 from her checking account and no clear plan beyond being present when the cabinet came up. She had noticed during the half hour before the sale opened 2 other people who were spending time near the sewing room. One was a woman in her 60s in a gray cardigan who moved through the room with the particular attention of someone who knew what she was looking at. She picked up the dress form and examined the adjustment mechanisms. She opened one of the cabinet drawers and looked inside without touching anything, and then closed it again with an expression that Evelyn could not quite read. The other was a younger woman, maybe 30, with a tote bag and a notebook, who had asked one of the estate company men whether the cabinet contents were being sold as a single lot or individually, and who had written something down when he told her they were a single lot. Evelyn had watched both of them. She had not introduced herself. The estate company auctioneer reached the cedar cabinet at 11 in the morning. He described it the way auctioneers describe things that are outside their area of knowledge, with approximate gestures and useful vagueness. Custom-built cedar storage cabinet with contents including vintage sewing patterns, notions, fabric samples, some handwritten notebooks. He opened the cabinet door to show the pegs inside. He started the bidding at $40. The woman in the gray cardigan bid immediately. Evelyn bid. The younger woman bid. The woman in the gray cardigan bid again. Evelyn bid. The younger woman went to $125 and stopped and looked at Evelyn the way you look at someone when you are trying to decide how serious they are. Evelyn was very serious. She was also aware that she had $340 and that she had driven to Harlan in a car that needed a new alternator and that $340 was not, technically, all available for this purpose. The woman in the gray cardigan, $50. Bid $175. The woman in the gray cardigan looked at the cabinet for a moment. Then she looked at Evelyn. Evelyn had the particular expression of someone who has already decided, which is different from the expression of someone who is deciding. And the difference is visible to anyone who has spent time at auctions or negotiating tables, or anywhere that people make consequential choices under observation. The woman in the gray cardigan gave a small, precise nod and did not bid again. The $175. Evelyn Marsh bought her mother's 40 years of work for exactly what the estate company had priced it at, because the 2 women who might have understood its value had each, for their own reasons, decided to let it go, and because Evelyn was not going to let it go for any reason she could have named to anyone who asked her. She loaded the cabinet into her car that afternoon with help from a neighbor's teenage son, who did not understand why a woman was crying quietly while directing him on how to angle the drawers so they wouldn't shift during transport. She drove back to Cincinnati with the cabinet in her trunk and the 3 notebooks on the passenger seat beside her, where she could see them. Let me tell you about what happened in Cincinnati in the fall and winter of 1993, because that is where the story stops being about an estate sale and starts being about something else. Evelyn worked for a company called Hartfield Apparel, which made moderately priced women's clothing for department stores and had been doing so since 1947 with the reliable mediocrity of a business that had found a market position and defended it without particular ambition. Evelyn was the head of their pattern development department, a title that sounded more significant than the work warranted. What it meant in practice was that she supervised a team of 3 people who took designs from the company's 2 staff designers and translated them into production patterns, and that she spent most of her working hours managing the gap between what the designers envisioned and what could actually be cut and sewn at the production volume Hartfield required. She was competent at this. She had been competent at it for 23 years. She was also aware, in the way that you become aware of things after enough time has passed, that competence and satisfaction were not the same condition, and that she had been competent for a long time without being particularly satisfied. She started reading her mother's notebooks in October. She read them in the evenings at the kitchen table, which was the same way she had approached technical reading her whole professional life, with a notebook of her own open beside her for observations. But these were not technical documents exactly. They were something harder to categorize. They were the record of a mind working in private, writing not to explain itself to an audience but to understand itself more clearly, using the act of writing as a form of thinking rather than a form of communication. Ruth had documented failures with the same care she had given to successes, which was not how Evelyn had been trained, and not how she had ever seen anyone else in the industry approach the work. Most pattern development proceeded by moving forward. You made something, you fit it, you adjusted, you moved on. You did not stop to analyze why a particular adjustment had worked, or to record the specific conditions under which it would work and the conditions under which it would fail. There was no time for that in a production environment, and there was no tradition of it, and there was no one who asked for it. Ruth had done it anyway for 40 years because she was interested in understanding and had found that understanding required documentation. Evelyn finished the last notebook in December. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she called her colleague Diane Stutz, who had been at Hartfield for 12 years and who was the only person in the building whose judgment Evelyn trusted without reservation, and told her that she needed to come over on Saturday because there was something Evelyn needed her to read. Diane came on Saturday. She sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's notebooks for 4 hours. She read slowly, the way you read something that requires you to think as you go. At one point, she stopped and looked up and said, "Evelyn, your mother was solving problems that we run into every single season, and we don't know how to solve them." She went back to reading. When she finished the last one, she set it down carefully and said, "How long did it take her to work all this out?" 40 years. Diane said, "We've been doing this wrong our whole careers." She did not say it as a criticism of either of them. She said it as someone who has just seen something clearly for the first time and is adjusting to the view. Let me tell you about the spring of 1994, because that is when Evelyn Marsh made a decision that nobody at Hartfield Apparel saw coming, including the people who thought they knew her well. She gave notice in April. She had been at the company for 23 years and had a pension she was walking away from and a mortgage that did not stop when her salary did, and she was 53 years old, which is not the age at which people customarily decide to start over. She did these things because she had read her mother's notebooks and had recognized in them, with the specific clarity that comes from 23 years of looking at the same problems without being able to solve them correctly. A body of knowledge that answered questions the industry was not even asking. And because she believed, in the way her mother had believed things, that understanding you were holding was not yours to keep. It had to go somewhere, or it was just sitting in a cedar cabinet in a dead woman's sewing room. She converted the second bedroom of her Cincinnati apartment into a workroom. She moved her mother's cabinet in and set it along the wall the way her mother had kept it, with the drawers organized by category and the 3 notebooks on top where she could reach them. She built a fitting area with a proper mirror and a dress form she found at an estate sale in Covington, and she took on clients, private clients, alterations and custom work, but also gradually consultation work. Small designers and independent manufacturers who had heard, through Diane Stutz and through a slow accumulation of word of mouth that Evelyn did not cultivate and could not entirely explain, that Evelyn Marsh could look at a fit problem and tell you not just what was wrong but precisely why it was wrong and exactly what it would take to fix it. She charged modestly, which was the habit of her mother in her, and which she did not try to correct because she was not doing it for the money and she knew it. She was doing it because the problems were interesting and because her mother's notebooks kept showing her new ways to understand them, and because every time she solved something she had never been able to solve at Hartfield, she felt a specific satisfaction that she had no other word for than rightness. Now let me pause here and ask you something. What did Evelyn Marsh actually buy in that sewing room in Harlan County for $175? She bought a cedar cabinet. She bought 3 notebooks and 40 years of brown craft paper patterns with pencil notations in the margins. She bought 40 years of a woman working alone in a room with no audience and no recognition and no particular expectation of either, teaching herself things that nobody had thought to teach and writing them down because writing was how she understood and understanding was what she was after. What Evelyn did with those things was not buy herself a business exactly. She bought herself a way of working that fit her in a way that 23 years at Hartfield had not. She bought at 53 the second half of a career that the first half had been quietly preparing her for without her knowing it. That is not a small transaction. That is not a story about finding something valuable at an estate sale and cashing it in. That is a story about a woman who understood what she was holding when nobody else did, and who was willing to reorganize her entire life around what she understood. But let me tell you about the part that most people don't know, because the sewing room is not where this story ends. Let me tell you about the woman in the gray cardigan. Her name was Frances Doyle, and she was 64 years old in the fall of 1993, and she ran a dry goods and tailoring shop in Harlan that had been in her family since her grandmother's time. Frances had known Ruth Marsh the way people know each other in small counties, steadily and at a certain distance, and she had known that Ruth did fine work because she had seen it on the bodies of women around town for 40 years. She had known that Ruth was skilled. She had not known the scale of what Ruth had built in that sewing room, because Ruth had not told anyone, and because Frances, like most people, had not thought to ask. She had gone to the estate sale out of the habit of 40 years in the business, and she had opened that cabinet drawer and seen the brown craft paper patterns with their notations and understood, in the way that someone with her background would understand, that what she was looking at was not ordinary. But she had looked at Evelyn Marsh's face during the bidding and had seen something in it that made her stop. She thought about it for months afterward. She thought about it in the shop on slow Tuesday afternoons, and she thought about it driving home in the evenings, and she thought about it with the specific persistence of something that is trying to show you what you missed. Let me tell you about the morning in November of 1995 when Frances Doyle called Evelyn Marsh in Cincinnati. Evelyn had been running her workroom for a year and a half by then. She had a small but steady client list and a growing reputation among the independent designers who worked in the region between Cincinnati and Louisville, and she had spent the previous winter beginning the work of organizing her mother's notebooks into something she thought could be shared more broadly. She had not gotten far with it. The notebooks were not written for an outside audience, and translating them required a kind of care and patience that her actual work kept interrupting. Frances had gotten her number from a woman in Harlan who had visited the Cincinnati workroom the previous summer. She called on a Tuesday morning and identified herself and said, without preamble, that she had been at the estate sale and that she had been the one bidding against Evelyn, and that she had stopped because she had seen something in Evelyn's face that she hadn't seen in her own, and that this had bothered her for 2 years. Evelyn said she remembered her. Frances said she had a problem she had been working on for 20 years, a recurring fit issue in women's garments involving a particular combination of shoulder slope and back length that caused the center back seam to rotate under any kind of movement, and that she had never found a reliable solution for. She said she had talked to every tailor she knew and had bought every book she could find, and had never found anyone who could explain to her exactly why it happened and what it would take to stop it. Evelyn said, "Sit down, that's in the notebooks." Frances was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The notebooks in the cabinet." Evelyn said, "Yes." Frances drove to Cincinnati 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning and sat at Evelyn's kitchen table for 5 hours. Evelyn put the notebooks in front of her and made coffee and let her read. At one point, Frances stopped and held a page close to the light and said she worked out the geometry herself, not as a question, as a statement of something she was trying to absorb. Evelyn said she worked everything out herself. Frances finished the relevant sections and sat for a while. Then she said, "I've spent 20 years on this problem." Evelyn said, "My mother spent about 4 years on it before she understood it." Frances looked at the notebook. She said, "She never showed this to anyone." Evelyn said, "I don't think it occurred to her that there was anyone to show it to." That was as close as either of them came to talking about what had been lost and almost lost in that cedar cabinet in Harlan County. Let me tell you about what Frances Doyle did after she drove back to Harlan, because it is not what you might expect. She did not become a convert or a disciple. She was 64 years old and had run her own business for 35 years and did not have the temperament for either role. What she became was a connector. When the younger women in Harlan, who wanted to learn serious sewing, asked her where they should look, she started telling them about Evelyn Marsh in Cincinnati. She did this without credit and without fanfare. She simply directed people toward the place where the knowledge lived, because she had spent a morning reading 3 notebooks and understood that the knowledge in them was worth knowing, and that someone needed to be pointed toward it. She also did something that took her longer, because it required admitting something she had not fully admitted to herself. She went back to Evelyn's workroom on a Saturday 6 months after the Thursday visit and asked if she could look at the notebooks again. Not the sections on fitting, the sections on failure. She sat with those sections for 3 hours. She read the accounts of things Ruth had tried that hadn't worked, and the careful analysis of why they had failed. She read the records of mistakes made and understood and not repeated, and the distinctions Ruth had drawn between mistakes that taught something and mistakes that merely cost time. She read with the particular concentration of someone who has been in business a long time and who recognizes, with the slight discomfort of recognition, a standard of attention that is higher than their own. When she was done, she said to Evelyn, "Your mother wrote down her failures." Evelyn said she thought they were the most important part. Frances considered that for a moment. She said, "I've been in this business for 35 years, and I've never written down a failure." Evelyn said, "Neither had I until I read those notebooks." Frances drove home to Harlan. She went into the back of the shop where she kept her own work files, and she took out a composition notebook and she started writing down the problem she had been working on for 20 years. Not the solution which she now had, the problem. How it had presented, what she had tried, why each attempt had fallen short of what she needed. She wrote for 2 hours, with the specific discomfort of someone doing a kind of work they are not practiced at. And when she was done, she looked at what she had written and understood, for the first time, the shape of 20 years of effort. She kept the notebook at her workbench. She added to it until she retired in 2002. When she retired, she left the shop to her niece, a woman named Carol, who had been apprenticing there for 4 years and who had the hands and the patience and the intelligence for the work. Frances left Carol the keys and the client list and the back inventory and the notebook. She told Carol to read the notebook before she changed anything about how the shop ran. Carol read it over a weekend and called Frances on Monday morning and said, "Aunt Frances, why didn't you show me this 3 years ago?" Frances said she hadn't known it was worth showing until she read someone else's. Let me tell you about the winter of 1997 in Cincinnati, because that is when Evelyn Marsh finished a project she had started 3 years earlier and nearly abandoned twice. She had been working, in the hours between client appointments and the slow days of January and February, on organizing her mother's notebooks into something that could be read by someone who had not grown up watching Ruth Marsh work. It was harder than she had expected. The notebooks were not written as instruction. They were written as thought, and translating thought into instruction required a kind of editorial work that was different from anything Evelyn had done in her professional life, and that required her, repeatedly, to go back to the source material and sit with it until she understood not just what her mother had concluded, but how she had gotten there. She finished in February of 1997. What she had produced was 280 pages, which she called, in the understated way she had inherited from Ruth, a working guide to garment fit. She had it printed by a small press in Cincinnati and sold it through her workroom and through a network of independent designers and tailors who had heard about it before it was finished. She priced it at $38. The first print run of 400 copies sold out in 5 months. She printed 800 more. The letters she received came from tailors and costume designers and pattern makers and fashion design students in 30 states, and eventually from 2 women in Canada and a man in Australia who had found it through professional contacts. Many of them said some version of the same thing, which was that the guide had given them language for problems they had been experiencing for years without being able to articulate, and that this language had allowed them to solve the problems in a way that understanding and documentation, rather than trial and error, made possible. One letter came from a woman in Lexington who said she had taken one of the ideas in the guide and applied it to a completely different problem in theatrical costuming, and that it had worked in a way she had not anticipated, and that she had been teaching it to her students at the university there for 2 semesters. Evelyn wrote back to most of them. She kept the letters in a shoebox in the cedar cabinet in the top drawer, which she had cleared for the purpose. The dedication page of the guide read, "For Ruth Marsh, who wrote it all down for herself and didn't know she was writing it for everyone else." Let me tell you about the morning in the fall of 2001 when Evelyn's daughter came into the workroom. Her name was Clara, and she was 27 years old, and she had just finished a master's degree in textile conservation at a university in Boston and had come back to Cincinnati with no particular plan and the mild disorientation of someone who has spent years acquiring expertise and is not yet sure where it belongs. Clara had grown up visiting the workroom, had spent time there as a teenager doing whatever was useful, and had developed, in the way that children develop things when they are present for them long enough, an understanding of the work that she did not fully recognize as understanding because she had never had to learn it consciously. Clara sat down at the end of the workbench, on the stool her mother used, and said she had been thinking about something. Evelyn looked up from the jacket she was altering. Clara said that her conservation work had been focused on historical textiles museum collections, the techniques of the 18th and 19th centuries. But she had been noticing, in the last year of her program, that the garments from the 1940s and 1950s, the generation just before Ruth Marsh's working prime, were starting to come apart in ways that nobody in the conservation world fully understood, because the techniques of that era were poorly documented and the people who had used them were gone or going. She said she thought there was a gap. She said she thought someone should be documenting those techniques now, before the last practitioners of them had died and the knowledge had no place to live. Evelyn set down the jacket. She thought about a sewing room in Harlan County and a cedar cabinet with a yellow sticker and $175 written on it. She thought about what it had taken to move that cabinet to Cincinnati, and what would have happened to the notebooks if she had not been there on a Thursday evening in September of 1993, reading in the low light of a room that smelled like cedar and her mother's particular brand of patience. She said, "You're right. Start with the tailoring techniques from 1945 to 1960. There's a woman in Lexington I want you to call first. She's been working with some of this material. Tell her I sent you." Clara said, "That's it? Just start?" Evelyn said, "Just start. Write everything down. Write down what works and what doesn't, and write down why. Don't wait until you understand it to document it. Document the not understanding. That's what your grandmother did." Clara Marsh spent the next 3 years working with practitioners and curators and collectors across the Upper South and Midwest, and the 4 years after that developing what she had gathered into a set of working documents that became the foundation of a small organization in Cincinnati dedicated to the preservation of mid-century American garment construction techniques. She named the organization after her grandmother's county, not her grandmother's name, because that was what Ruth would have preferred. The workroom in Cincinnati is still there. Clara runs it now alongside the organization. Evelyn retired in 2013 at 72 and spent her retirement doing what her mother had spent her life doing, working on garments in a quiet room, writing things down, charging almost nothing for it. She died in 2021. The obituary in the Cincinnati Enquirer mentioned the guide and the workroom and her years at Hartfield Apparel. It did not mention the estate sale in Harlan County in September of 1993, or the cedar cabinet, or the $175, or the way a woman standing in a sewing room on a Thursday evening had understood what she was holding before she had any way to explain why she understood it. Most obituaries leave out the moment that changed the direction of everything. Let me tell you one last thing, because Frances Doyle has one more appearance in this story, and it matters. When Carol took over the shop in Harlan in 2002, she found the notebook Frances had left her and read it the way Frances had said to. She found in it, alongside the technical records and the problem histories, a short entry near the back that Frances had written in 2001, the year before she retired. It read in Frances's handwriting, "I spent 35 years in this work and almost bought the most important thing I ever saw for $150 and decided not to. I still don't entirely know why I stopped. I think I saw that the other woman needed it more. I think I also saw that I didn't know what I needed it for, and she did. Knowing what something is for is not the same as knowing what it is. I learned the second thing too late to do much with it. Carol is going to learn both things. Make sure she starts writing them down." Carol read that entry on a Sunday afternoon in November. Then she went to the shelf behind the sewing machine and took down a composition notebook and opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top, and below it the first problem she was working on, what it was, what she had tried, what had almost worked but hadn't, and why. She has been adding to it since. There are 4 notebooks now, on the shelf next to the machine, in Carol's handwriting, organized in the way that people organize things when they have been shown the value of organization by someone who understood it before they did. Some knowledge does not disappear. It waits in a cedar cabinet in a sewing room until someone comes in who is able to read what it is, and then it moves forward in the only way that anything real ever moves forward, From one pair of hands to the next, dollars patient and specific and particular, dollars earned by the work and kept by the writing and passed on, because there is no other way to make sure it does not have to be learned again from the beginning by someone who does not know that it has already been figured out. Dollars. I think about Evelyn standing in that sewing room on a Thursday evening, reading her mother's notebooks in low light, and I think about how close it came to going the other way. If she had not driven down from Cincinnati, dollars. If she had trusted the estate company's $175 sticker and assumed it was correct. If she had done what most people do, dollars, which is to look at a price someone else has assigned to a thing and accept it as the truth about what the thing is worth. Dollars. She didn't, and I've spent a long time thinking about why. Dollars. Part of it was knowledge. Evelyn had 23 years in the apparel industry. She had the professional background to recognize what her mother had built in those notebooks, in a way that the estate company men, dollars, moving through the house with their clipboards and their efficient indifference, did not and could not. That kind of recognition is not luck, dollars. It is what happens when someone has spent decades learning something deeply enough that they can see what others miss, dollars. Ruth spent 40 years building a body of understanding. Evelyn spent 23 years developing the eye to recognize it. Neither of those things happened by accident. Dollars. But knowledge alone doesn't explain what Evelyn did. Plenty of people recognize value and still walk away. The $340 in her checking account was real. The car that needed a new alternator was real. The comfortable fact that she had already agreed to let the estate company handle everything was real, and real things have weight, and weight gives people reasons to stay where they are. Dollars. What Evelyn had beyond knowledge was the willingness to act on what she understood even when it cost her something. Dollars. She stood in that sewing room and made a decision that the notebooks would not sit in a stranger's back room being used for pressing fabric or lining a drawer. Dollars. She drove back to Cincinnati with a cedar cabinet in her trunk and 3 notebooks on the passenger seat, and then she spent the next 4 years figuring out what to do with what she had saved. Dollars. Then she walked away from 23 years and a pension because the notebooks had shown her a way of working that her whole career had been a preparation for, and she was not willing to know that and do nothing about it. Dollars. That is not a small thing. Most people know what they should do and don't do it. The gap between understanding and action is where most of the meaningful things in a life either happen or don't. Dollars. And then there is what she did with it. She could have kept the notebooks, studied them for herself, used them in her private work, and left it at that. Dollars. Instead, she spent 4 years translating her mother's private thought into something that could be read and used by anyone who needed it. Dollars. She sent it into the world at $38 a copy and received letters from 30 states, from people who said it had given them language for problems they had been living with for years. Dollars. Ruth never intended an audience. She was writing for herself to understand, because understanding was what she was after, and writing was how she got there. What Evelyn understood, standing in that sewing room, was that work done with that quality of honesty and that quality of attention does not belong only to the person who did it. It belongs to whoever can use it. Dollars. Getting it to those people was its own kind of work, and it required its own kind of courage. And Evelyn did it because she understood that knowing something and keeping it to yourself when others need it is its own form of loss. Dollars. Frances Doyle understood that too, eventually. Later than she would have liked, and she said so. But she understood it and she acted on it, and Carol has 4 notebooks on the shelf now because of what Frances finally learned to do. Dollars. The cedar cabinet is still in Cincinnati. Clara has it now. The 3 notebooks are on the top shelf where Evelyn put them the first day she moved in. Dollars. Some things you save, some things save you back.